Hello. This lecture discusses social science and American foreign policy. We begin with the question of why is it necessary to study politics using the scientific method or scientifically? For millennia, we've used what we would call political theory, from Aristotle and Plato to Kant to Sartre to many others, to examine politics. So why do we need to do it scientifically? Now, this is not a question to be answered on campus, but this is like what will be posted and what is expected, because clearly there's no simplistic answer, but there are good ones. And this lecture, the first part of it, will detail why it is necessary. And we'll conclude with applying that necessity to American foreign policy while acknowledging and identifying limitations. Because a good scientist knows when to say, I don't know. And we'll explore that. So why do we have to have this discussion at all? Well, first is that political science is typically thought of not as a science. Right? It's typically thought of as civics. So people who have had high school education and into college and PhDs and all kinds of stuff. It's not level of education, but what you're exposed to typically in the public school system is really typically civics. Right? Why do we have three branches of government? What's in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, yada, yada, yada. That's not social science. That's not political science. And when we do start to transition to political science, we often have really unflattering views. So if you click that video from The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon, in fairly graphic detail, says what he thinks of social science is that it's not really science. It's not physics, right? This isn't geosciences. This isn't chemistry, where in chemistry you can do the same, and you do in intro chemistry, the same experiments that we've been doing for, in some cases, hundreds of years or at least 50 years in modern education, right? Everyone who takes Chem 1 does the same thing. You have to learn this skill set, this specific thing. Social science has more flexibility. Now, I'm a statistician. I've taken extensive courses in statistics to be able to conduct social science, and so I would argue that we have every bit as rigorous a structure as the physical sciences. We just have subjects that are a little bit more difficult to understand, and more importantly, we haven't been doing this as long. Right? The modern study of physics, a couple hundred years old, even longer. Modern political scientists, modern political science, 1960s-ish. Right? So it makes sense that we haven't progressed as far as we have in others. But political science is a science. It's like economics or psychology. So how do we study political science, and where do we get the information? How do we go about it? First, in the chapter, or not in the chapter, it's not assigned, but if you had taken my intro to IR class or some of my lower division classes, which about half of you have, this is the importance of observation. Right? What is empiricism? So there's lots of ways that you could potentially know something. Right? Empiricism is one of them. Epistemologically speaking, we talk about a tabula rasa if we're talking about political science, and we think of the early thought of tabula rasa, blank slate, that there's no innate knowledge, there's nothing that comes from you, and so everything becomes observation. Or it could be innate. There could just be things that we know. Okay, so this would be similar to a reflex. Don't touch a hot oven. That's something that's innate. So what is empiricism? Well, it's observation. We want to build theories for how social behavior and political behavior is conducted. And what is a theory? It's a logically consistent set of statements that explain the phenomenon. Okay, so in here, you might think of a theory for why you get hungry in the morning. Well, it could be you didn't eat enough, or you didn't eat the right concentration of things, or perhaps you didn't eat enough yesterday. Right? That's a logical set of statements. What we want to get to, and what we engage in this class, are not the facts of the day. Okay, so if you come into this class expecting to debate current events constantly, you're going to be disappointed, because that's not what political science is. Political science is the study of those events, mostly as data points, to move towards bigger ideas and theories, to really transcend the daily talking points of politics. And how do we go about this? What are the characteristics of empiricism? So each of these 5 you need to go through and you need to know them. I am going to focus only on parsimony for the sake of time and attention, right? But because the other ones I think are, well, and non-normative. The others 3 are fairly straightforward. What is parsimony? Here is that simple is better. Not that simplistic. Don't confuse those two. Simple is usually better. This is Occam's razor, right? That usually the simplest explanation is the best one. One way to think about this would be a childhood fear. So if you are afraid of the dark and you see a shadow, right, when you're a child, you think, oh my goodness, that looks like a dinosaur and there's monsters, and you just go da-da-da-da-da. But in reality, the Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, it's a shadow from your puppet or from a stuffed animal or something, is the best explanation. That's how science works as well. In this case, we think about Occam's razor or parsimony in that social phenomenon are extraordinarily difficult to identify the factors that produce them. So we think about a natural phenomenon. Think about oil. How does oil form? Well, in a very oversimplified example, organic matter from millions of years ago gets compressed. Depending on its chemical composition, it can liquefy and become the hydrocarbon that we know as oil. Okay, that's pretty simple. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's very different than saying, why do people protest? Why do people vote? Right? Do you vote because you, well, let's not do voting, but, or why do people not vote in the case of the United States? Simple is better. So another way to think about this is, if we think about foreign policy, let's say, why does the United States use force? That's a question we're going to deal with a lot early on in this question, or in this course. There's more than one reason. And then what happens if you think about presidential uses of force, which we'll specifically study, and the president's an individual? Well, what motivates individuals? Oh my goodness. Now we got a whole bunch. It's not saying we can't study social science or we can't study political science. It's that says, unlike a physics experiment or a chemistry experiment, with a ratio, let's say a chemistry experiment, you know exactly the ratios to produce a reaction in the lab. You get those chemicals, you put them together, this is exactly what will happen, and we can repeat it infinity. Can't do that in social science for a lot of reasons. The next is non-normative, and here I just want to reiterate for those who have not, or iterate and then reiterate for those who've had it and not had the class, that we are not making normative judgments in this class. I'm a scientist, and I've actually embraced this identity much more the further away I've gotten from graduate school, because I care about factual and objective determinations. Your opinions, my opinions, whatever, they're important. Engage, debate. Those are what you want to have around Thanksgiving dinner table. But when we think about social science, it's a non-normative investigation. So for example, if I'm investigating why the United States uses force, right? Even if I think that sometimes the United States uses force immorally or unethically, that does not inform how I investigate it. Or vice versa. What if I think the United States only uses righteous force abroad? Okay, neither one of those are true, right? The United States is just like any other country. It's a mess, okay? Oh, well, it's a non-normative theory. So when you read social science, oftentimes, especially with economics research, you may point to something that you think is in the research that may or may not be there. We see this countless times in the media and in the scholarly use of work, or the use of scholarly work by non-scholars, right? And we're going to deal with some of that scientific stuff as we move through this class, so you can become a better consumer of information and data. The next section of this discussion thinks specifically about concepts, and then we talk about research design and limitations of social science. When we think about what the building block of all science is, arguably, are concepts. What is a concept? Well, according to Goering, a political scientist who works on this, commonly said that one can prove practically anything simply by defining terms in a convenient way. So what you define as a concept matters, right? What constitutes it makes it different. Now, in social science, some of this is very difficult to do. Yeah, so for example, let's take one from the headlines. And so you say, oh, well, you said we weren't going to talk about headlines. No, we are. We're absolutely going to talk about the things of the day. We're talking about American foreign policy. We're going to talk about Americans' constituency. But that's not the driving force, right? We want to use those as examples within a science context. So let's think about something like peaceful protest. Okay, so let's talk about what peaceful means. What does peace mean? What is a peaceful protest, right? The Constitution guarantees your protection to protest. Now, it doesn't mean at any time, in any place, in any manner. All of those are actually conditioned by different laws, different states, and federal regulations. But what's a peaceful protest? And now here comes the big question I want you to think about. What is the difference between peaceful and non-peaceful protests? Is it a brick, one brick? Is it when police use force, when protesters use force, when property is damaged? How much damage? How much force? What a percentage of people? Does it matter if it's police or the population? Who's doing it? I don't know, right? I honestly, so as a scientist, I would say this is not an area I study. I don't know, but I want you to think about that, okay? Because one thing in social science, especially political science, is concept stretching. And what that means is we will take something that we think applies, or we'll use it in how scholars have defined it, and we'll move it to another context, or we'll stretch it, and it may or may not contain that concept anymore. Right? You may actually lose what you think you were arguing about, and the moment you can't define your terms, you've lost the argument in an intellectual sense. What I mean by this is if you read political theory, or you read any philosophy, or anything on ethics or behavior, typically an author will spend a huge chunk of the introduction section, whether that's chapters or a section of the chapter, simply defining the terms. This is also why we have lawyers, right? So it sounds wonderful. Right? Lawyers are great. People often deride them, but we need lawyers. If you've ever read legislation or worked in Congress, like I did when I was a student, and you look at how we pass laws, the reason why we need a judiciary and we need lawyers is because they're usually really vague laws. It'll say something along the lines of, this money may be spent on utility refurbishment. Great. Okay, utilities, we should know what that is. That's electricity and water and sewer. What does refurbishment mean? Does that mean we can replace new things, or can we extend support if it's a new area that we come under? What can be covered? That's what lawyers do. They define the terms. In most Supreme Court cases, not most, actually most, the ones we hear about, this may not be the case, but most Supreme Court cases turn on definitions. Right? Whether that is a definition of the First Amendment, Second Amendment, or a specific thing in the bill. Okay, so why are concepts important, and why is it difficult? I want you to think of the following terms and ask somebody, what does health mean? How would you conceptualize and operationalize health? What does that mean? Now we're finally entering into an era when health can be defined with mental health. Right? Is it only physical? What does health mean? Does that mean the lack of disease? Okay, all right, that could be health. What about those of us who are getting gray hair? Right? And their knees hurt more often. Is that still health? Or is it degradation of time? Right? This is just health. What about food? Food's my favorite to do in class. And I can't believe we don't get to do this. And I wish we could, because what's food? Right? Is food only organic, locally sourced, seasonal? Or is food nutrition? Or is food whatever you consume? What if could food something like nicotine gum? You don't eat it, but you do ingest it for the benefit of nicotine. Nicotine's horrible. It's not like it's a benefit, but that's why you do it. Right? It's highly addictive, very terrible. Right? What counts as food? Do insects that you eat? Right? Is food only what you consider food, or different cultures or different areas? Food's a tough one. Okay. Now, when we get through this, all of the following review them. Again, I'm only going to talk about the two that I highlight, not because the others aren't important, but I think the others are self-explanatory. A good concept must be internally consistent. It has to have coherence. This is really important for political science because if we think about use of force, which is a variable we're going to spend a lot of time on, well, a week and a half in this class, if it's the use of force, we need to make sure we know what force means and what use is. Because as you can imagine, if there's different thresholds for the use of force, you have different data sets, and that may produce different outcomes. Okay, so you must be internally consistent. And this also means definitionally internally consistent. Okay, so if we think about use of force, and we're talking here about, and there's multiple ways to do this, but if we just think physical use of force, okay, that's military kinetic energy, right? You shot something, whether it's a laser beam or a bomb, there's something in there. If we say, okay, you need to be internally consistent with that, does the use of force then mean surveillance drones? Right? If it has to be kinetic, no, it wouldn't. Right? Surveillance drones would not be a use of force. If we expand use of force to say when the United States uses military capacity to attempt to influence an outcome, surveillance would absolutely be consistent. So we have to have internal consistency. Next you have to have differentiation. We need to be able to be sure that the concepts are bounded. What we mean by that is there's a limit to them. They can be operationalized. Okay, we can try to measure them. They're there. And they have some position within physical or sociological space. Here what we just mean is that you can put them somewhere. The easiest way to think about this might be on a map. So we think about the importance of rivers, oceans, mountains for history, really, but in many contexts. That's a boundary that can be operationalized. All right, so make sure you review the other ones, but they're there. Okay, so these are all taken from Johnson Reynolds and Mykoff. It's the same textbook I use in international relations, but I want the refresher. I want to make sure you have the dependent variable and explanatory variable sample, the unit of analysis, and the estimator. You'll need all of these when you complete your article reviews. What is the dependent variable? That's a better definition than what I'm going to tell you, but the dependent variable is the thing we care about, the thing we're trying to explain. Okay, so in many cases in the first section of this class, we're trying to explain the use of force. Okay, we're trying to explain why U.S. presidents use force when they do. Okay? An explanatory variable, and I don't use the word independent, I use explanatory. So physicists can and should use the word independent because they can identify with absolute certainty what influences their variables because of the way experimentation works, but they're dependent variables because of experimentation, design, advancement of theory, chemistry, biology. You can do all those. Social science, there is a lot more contagion. That's exactly what I mean out of that. So an explanatory variable in a chemistry experiment or physics experiment is mass, pressure, temperature, right? You start manipulating those three variables with some kind of quantity in there, you can calculate what the other outcomes will be. Social science is we're not that good. We're not that good, right? So what, for example, let's say a basic one of what's going to determine whether you vote or not. For the most part, we can identify the likelihood of voting based on a couple of variables. Is it perfect? Nope, sure isn't. Which is why statistical anomalies happen. Okay, what about the explanatory variable? Again, use their definition. I would just say the thing that influences what you want to explain, the variable that influences the outcome. So later in the class, we're going to be looking at private military and security companies, and we're actually going to be focusing on them as the explanatory variable to organize the entire section. And there's going to be a lot of different dependent variables because when you're interested in private security companies, we want to know what they do, right? We do want to know who hires them and some of this other stuff, where they're the dependent variable, but mostly we want to know what are they doing in the world? Why is the UN hiring these things? Why does the United States hire these things? Okay, sample and unit of analysis. Sample is just the data used to study it. The unit of analysis is the spatial and temporal dimensions or component dimensions by which you generate your sample. So in political science, you're going to have over time, typically years or months, sometimes quarters, and sometimes even days, as the time variable. So you say, I'm studying presidential use of force from 1980 to 2015. Okay, so how Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon used force, I can't really talk about, but I can talk about 80 to 2005 or whatever. Okay, that is your unit of analysis. It's spatial, it's temporal. Spatial component with unit of analysis is what countries or leaders or regions are involved in the analysis. So what's the breakdown of it? And for most of our studies in this class, we are going to have something that's country years. So we're looking at a phenomenon, whether that's, say, terrorist attacks, civilian casualties, use of force, nuclear deployments. We're looking at that per country, per year, globally, typically. All right, that's the unit of analysis. Finally, the estimator. What's the estimator? It is the statistics based on observation to an unknown population parameter. So a simplified way to think about this is the estimation and the estimating process and the coefficients are the process by which we use a sample to get a sense of what's going on in the population. So this is easiest to do in voting. If you see a Gallup poll, there'll be 1,003 individuals polled, right? That's kind of the minimum number that you would need, given some other conditions, to generate a representative sample of the United States registered voters, for example. Why do we not try to talk to every registered voter? Obviously, it's super expensive and it's unnecessary because of the law of large numbers and some other fancy calculus stuff. Okay, so when we think through this, what the estimator is telling us is how it connects to the population. Okay, so this class is statistically based. The textbook doesn't have a whole lot of statistics, but you will be exposed to a lot of statistics. Not necessarily that you have to understand all of them. I want you to be able to read it as a consumer. Right? You don't have to produce it. You don't have to produce it. And there will never be a test question, calculate something. That's not the point of this class. The point of this class, though, is to engage social science and political science. And there's 3 questions here that we need to get into. How, when you're reading an academic article, an empirical academic article, and you come to the results section, there are 3 questions you need to ask with each variable. Is it statistically significant? What direction is the effect? What is the substantive effect? Okay, the first one, and all of these are given to you by the author. You really just need to read the plain English. Is it statistically significant? The author will tell you the results are statistically significant with our expectation. You can also just look at the chart. There'll be asterisks next to the ones that are significant. Then you have to say what direction is the effect. What here we mean is there a negative sign next to it. So as you increase the explanatory variable, what happens to the dependent variable? So for example, as unemployment goes up, the use of force goes up under certain conditions. Okay? Or if inflation goes up, does the use of force go down? That would be a negative relationship. And then finally, you have to identify the substantive effect. Here you need to dig into the article and find the sentence or paragraphs that make the research results approachable for you and for me. Well, I can do the stats part, but you know what I mean, right? So anybody who reads the article and thinks critically about it should be able to process the substantive effects, because there's going to be a sentence that says the substantive effect of my key variable on the dependent variable is something. And they will say something along the lines of, moving from the mean to the maximum of my variable increases the likelihood of the dependent variable by 50%. Okay, that's substantively meaningful. Okay, that part will be written and explicit for you. So remember, don't be overwhelmed by statistics. Email me, call me, do whatever it is to contact me if it stresses you or if you need help explaining it. But remember, the baseline is statistical significance, direction, and effect. Okay, the next portion of this lecture deals with theory building and knowledge, and scientific knowledge. How do we move through this process? Well, we have prior knowledge, which I would argue is basically your literature review. You have theoretical expectations, that's the argument in the article. And then you have a formal hypothesis, where there's some kind of explanatory variable, some kind of effect, the dependent variable, and then you test these things. And if you test stuff a lot and use different samples and different arguments and different theories, eventually, potentially, maybe, under some conditions in social science, you may produce scientific knowledge. Neil deGrasse Tyson would call scientific knowledge objective truth, which we'll deal with in a minute. In social science, there are very few of these. I would say none, but I was trying not to think of in infinitives. There are very few of these. We're not there yet. We have mid-range theories, so things that are broadly consistent, that have been tested extensively, that we're finding general support for. But it would not reach scientific knowledge. And why this becomes important is when we use science, or we casually say, oh, well, science says. Science doesn't say anything. What you have to be able to do is aggregate dozens, if not hundreds, of scientific studies and scientific insight to produce scientific knowledge. You don't just get to run out and find your most favorite or newest article and say, see, this is truth. No, that's one piece potentially of truth, but that's not how science works. Okay, so this comes to Dr. Tyson's intro to his masterclass video, and I do expect you to watch that video, and there will be a test question on it. He's obviously wonderful, and his intro poses deep questions for this class without getting really into the crux of what he's doing. And the reason is that he identifies 3 types of truths. Because one aspect of political science is people want to make it their own, right? My political truth. Well, you can have a political truth, a personal truth. Absolutely, right? You can believe what you want. It may or may not be rooted in social science, right? It may or may not be supported in scientific evidence, and it might be. Right? So when we think about why it's so hard for scientific knowledge to be produced in political science in particular, there's a couple of answers for that. One is that we're still debating concepts. The second is that we don't have a lot of samples, right? So if we're studying terrorism globally from 1967 to 2015, we only have one sample of that. Right? We have almost 200 countries eventually over that time. So we have lots of observations, but there's only one sample. Okay? Next is we don't get to do experiments. Right? It turns out that, for good reason, no one allows political scientists just to randomly assign, not randomly, but experimentally assign political leaders. Right? So it would be great if they, over the 50 governors, if they would just let us pick, purely for social science reasons, say 25 of them and 25 controls. Right? You let us pick because we're testing who makes good governors. Right, we could do this. Like, we could actually do this and tell you, have some insights for that. But for good reason, no one would ever think that's a good idea, right? That's a terrible idea from a social, practical, functional standpoint. But that's what science really needs. Political science can't do that. So Dr. Tyson identifies 3 types of truths: personal, political, and objective. Okay, if we think about personal truth, that's what is yours, right? That's what. It's not right or wrong. It can be normative or non-normative, but it's what you know to be true, and it applies to you. Okay, so for example, a personal truth for me, I have to work out in the morning. Don't work out in the morning, not as productive in the rest of the day. It's just how it is. It's a personal truth. Right now, is that deep? No, of course it's not, but it's a video, and I don't know how much to share. We think about the next thing he says is a political truth. Right? I would think, unfortunately, I don't know him personally, but I would argue he would probably say, political truths are what we're talking about in political science. If we can generate a whole bunch of evidence, we can have some truth, but it's still got a lot of limitations, right? And this is where we would say things like, we can identify problems in society, we may not have the best answer. And then he would say that there's objective truths, right? These are laws of the universe. As an astrophysicist, he is somebody who has applied the scientific method at its absolute most refined level. And that's objective truth. Okay? Now, what are the implications for political science if he's right? I'm not saying he is, or you have to accept that, but let's say, for argument's sake, that he is. Well, then political truths are going to be lesser than objective truths, right? So we absolutely can say we need a fair system, or taxation should be this way, or I don't know, borders should or shouldn't exist, right? There could be like these truths out there, but they're not the same as objective because they're informed by society. Now, I would actually disagree with that. I would have the counter argument that It's possible, I would argue, to identify political objective truths. I'm not saying we've done it yet, okay? And I don't know if it would happen in my lifetime, though computing power is helping us get there. But there are, I would argue, political truths that are objective, right? There are certain things that we can discover that are as consistent as gravity, even though gravity can bend and some cool stuff, right? So I'm not saying we're going to get there. We're not there yet in political science by any stretch of the imagination, but I think the continuum suggests that it's possible. But I could be wrong. Okay. Why is it important for foreign policy? What are the implications for public policy and governments if empirical knowledge is applied? This one is your first discussion board post. I want you to answer that question. What are the implications for public policy and governance if empirical knowledge is implied? And take both sides of this. Think, okay, so we do generate some important political knowledge. What happens if we apply it? What happens if the science is wrong? Or what if the science isn't sufficiently tailored to the circumstance? Or what if the science is so plain and so clear that it's ridiculous that we've been doing something else? Consider all those alternatives and answer the question. So what you need to do is just cut and paste. What are the implications for public policy and governance if empirical knowledge is implied? Put that into the discussion board as you're at the top of it, and write 300 to 500 words on that. I simply want your opinion on it. Okay? There's no right or wrong answer to this either, so this is complete or incomplete. I hope that's clear. I want you to recognize the limitations of foreign policy when you answer that question. Not when you answer that question, that came out wrong. As you process this class. And this is something I've thought on for longer than I care to admit, that there are so many things that scholars are good at. I mean, we're exceptional at. That's what we are trained to do. We are trained to answer specific questions, provide insights, general trends, and analysis. Well, what else is going on? Alexander George, a very famous political scientist, wrote the following: scholars may not be in a good position to advise policymakers how best to deal with a specific instance of a general problem that requires urgent and timely action, but they can often provide a useful, broader discussion of how to think about and understand the general problem. That statement is just so true. And here's the example. There's lots of them, but we can say something along the lines of, before the Iraq War, regardless of what you thought about it, hundreds of scholars identified that invading Iraq posed significant problems because of the ethnic fractionalization, the disparity in political representation, poverty induced based on ethnicity and religion, from a whole host of studies. Like invading is difficult. Doesn't mean, I'm not commenting on justified or not, that you deal with that in another class. Actually, we do deal with it in another class of mine if you take it. What I want you to think through, though, is, does that mean that, in this case, George Bush should have picked up the phone and called a professor at Harvard and be like, hey, how's this going to turn out? No. Right? Because the scholar at Harvard, unless they're an Iraqi specialist or an Iraqi, then would say something along the thing of this quote and say, listen, I don't know a whole lot about Iraq or what's going to happen after, but I can tell you this. In general, what happens when other states conduct what you're proposing, X, Y, and Z happens from and the sample that we're using for this would actually be 1815 until 2000. Okay, so in that almost 200-year window, this is what happens. That's what we're good at. Right? So why can I comfortably say Syria was going to deteriorate into civil war and the Assad regime was likely going to survive? Well, because there's a lot of literature that suggests if you have a major power patron and the issue at hand is not a national priority for another major power, the major power that's involved typically can at least can achieve a neutral outcome, right? Well, what does that say for U.S. foreign policy? Nothing. At the end is nothing, because Syria is a little bit different, right? The United States could have, whether it was President Obama or was it President Trump, either one of them could have chose different tactics or different impacts or different approaches. And the general trend of third-party sponsorship by major powers may not apply in that particular instance. That's what George is talking about here, right? So I think in scientific evidence and scientific actions, it's essential to know your limitations. All right. There's the review of it. This one a little long, but I think the social science component is so critical. Finish your discussion board post. Enjoyed it. Thanks.